In a quiet diner, a frail old man asked only for soup, yet the waiter mocked him, leaving the entire room frozen in shameful silence. Then, a man in the corner rose, slowly removed his hat, and every eye turned in shock. It was Keanu Reeves. What happened next stunned everyone forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The town of Millhaven woke slowly with the rhythm of another Tuesday. The morning sun stretched through the large front windows of the Sunrise Diner, casting long golden rectangles across the black and white tiled floor. The light made the chrome napkin holders glisten and turned every coffee pot on the counter into something warm and familiar. This diner wasn't just a place to eat. For decades, it had been the town's heart, where farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and weary travelers all crossed paths. Conversations drifted from one table to another, like threads weaving a quilt, pulling the whole town together with ordinary moments. Behind the counter, the smell of sizzling bacon and buttered toast filled the air, carried by the steady hiss of the grill. The bell above the door chimed every few minutes as regulars shuffled in, stomping dust off boots or brushing the last of the morning chill from their coats. Fran, the waitress who had been working here since the late 80s, moved with a rhythm only years of practice could teach. She filled mugs, refilled water glasses, and offered a warm smile that made newcomers feel welcome before they even ordered. Her voice carried over the soft background music of an old jukebox in the corner, calling out, "Order up for table 4." The diner buzzed with energy, but not chaos. A young couple leaned close together in a booth near the window, laughing softly. A group of construction workers occupied the long counter, their voices low but steady as they traded stories about work. An elderly pair sat by the door, splitting pancakes with a practiced comfort that spoke of years together. The Sunrise Diner lived up to its name, offering light and warmth to anyone who stepped inside. And then, the door opened again. The bell chimed softly, but this time, the sound seemed to carry a little farther. An old man stood in the doorway, pausing just a moment too long, as if deciding whether he belonged. His name was Edward, though no one in the diner knew it yet. His clothes were plain, worn thin in places, but they were clean. His shoes had lost their shine years ago, but they were laced carefully. His jacket sagged at the elbows, the fabric patched by a hand that had taken care to extend its life. His face carried deep lines, the kind that come from years of work and worry. But his eyes held a quiet steadiness, a dignity that refused to fade. For a second, he looked around the diner, as if expecting to be turned away. The crowd didn't notice much. Some looked up out of habit, then returned to their meals. A mother nudged her son back to his plate, and a man at the counter returned to his coffee. But Edward felt the weight of the glance, the subtle awareness that he was out of place among those who had come for hearty breakfasts or business lunches. Still, he took off his cap, held it in his hand, and nodded politely toward the hostess. "Just one?" she asked, her voice gentle, though her eyes lingered on his tired clothes. "Yes, ma'am. Just me today," he answered softly, his words careful, respectful. She led him to a small table near the center of the diner. He moved slowly, each step measured, his hand brushing the chair before lowering himself into it. The sigh he released wasn't loud, but it carried the exhaustion of a man who had spent most of his life pushing forward, always carrying more than his share. He rested his cap on the table, folding his hands around it as if it were something precious. What no one noticed was the man already sitting in the corner booth. His presence didn't announce itself the way others did. He wore a dark jacket, simple and unassuming, and a hat pulled low, shadowing most of his face. His hand, steady and strong, cradled a mug of black coffee he'd been nursing for nearly half an hour. He had slipped in quietly, the kind of man who drew little attention because he didn't demand it. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed the stillness about him, the kind of stillness that isn't born of idleness but of control. It was Keanu Reeves. He wasn't here as a movie star or a man of fame. He was here as a traveler passing through, taking a break from the road in the quiet company of coffee and silence. To most of the diners, he was just another customer, tucked in the corner booth, but behind the brim of his hat, his eyes were alert. He saw the old man hesitate at the door, saw the way his shoulders tightened when he felt the weight of the room. Keanu noticed what others overlooked. He always had. The diner hummed on. Plates clattered, coffee poured, voices rose and fell like waves. Yet beneath the surface of this ordinary Tuesday, something unseen was shifting. An old man had entered with dignity that deserved respect. A famous actor sat quietly, unseen but watchful. The day still looked ordinary, but within minutes, it would become the kind of story that no one in Millhaven would ever forget. Edward sat quietly at his table, smoothing the creases on his jacket sleeve as though he could press out the years written there. He picked up the menu, the edges worn soft from countless hands, and held it carefully, almost reverently. His eyes moved slowly over the choices, but the truth was written in the way his thumb lingered near the bottom of the page. He wasn't here for steak or a full breakfast spread. He was here for something simple, something within reach. A bowl of soup would be enough. Around him, life continued unbothered. The young couple by the window leaned closer still, their laughter spilling softly into the air. The construction crew at the counter waved for another round of coffee. Fran floated between tables with her unshakable smile, balancing plates as if they weighed nothing. To everyone else, the world hadn't shifted. To Edward, though, the simple act of sitting here was a test of belonging. In the corner, Keanu watched with quiet focus. His head remained low, hat shadowing his expression, but his eyes followed Edward's every movement. He noticed the way Edward's hand trembled slightly when he set the menu down, the way his shoulders pulled inward as though bracing against something unseen. Keanu didn't move. Not yet. Stillness was his strength. He had learned long ago that moments revealed themselves in silence, and rushing them only fractured their meaning. Outside, a truck rumbled past, shaking the glass in the front windows. The bell over the door chimed again as another customer entered, and the rhythm of the diner resumed its gentle pulse. But beneath it, like a quiet undertow, something else stirred. The old man had come for a meal. What he would find instead was a test of dignity. Edward folded his cap neatly on the table, a small gesture of respect in a world that often overlooked such things. He leaned back in his chair, letting his gaze drift across the diner. The clatter of forks and the steady hum of voices created a comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, it reminded him of Friday nights long ago, when he and his late wife would share a meal together in this very town. But the memory faded quickly, replaced by the sharp ache of absence. He cleared his throat and reached for the glass of water left by the hostess. The coolness steadied him, but only slightly. Each sip was deliberate, measured, as though he was conserving not just the water, but the moment itself. He wanted this simple lunch to matter. It wasn't about hunger alone. It was about belonging somewhere, even for an hour. Keanu lifted his mug again, eyes still fixed on the old man. He didn't yet know his story, but he recognized the look of someone who carried invisible weight. He had seen it before on film sets, in strangers at airports, in himself, on nights when the silence stretched too far. Edward's presence carried that same quiet heaviness, the kind that could break under the smallest cruelty. The diner's air shifted almost imperceptibly, like a stage being set before the curtain rises. Ordinary details suddenly felt sharpened. The scrape of a chair, the faint squeak of Fran's shoes against the floor, the sizzle from the grill in the back. All of it seemed to converge around Edward's table. Keanu felt it too. He leaned back, setting his mug down carefully. He didn't move, not yet. But the stillness in him deepened, readying for what was coming. Edward held the menu for a long while before setting it back down on the table. His fingers rested on the laminated surface as if reluctant to let go, but he already knew what he would order. Something light, something simple, something that would not draw attention. He cleared his throat softly, waiting for a server. Jason appeared from the far side of the room, carrying himself with the kind of restless energy that made his presence felt even before he spoke. He was tall, with sleeves rolled up too high and an expression that seemed permanently fixed between boredom and irritation. 3 months into his job at the diner, he had learned the routines, but not the spirit of service. To Jason, waiting tables was less about people and more about surviving the hours until he could clock out. He reached Edward's table with a pad in his hand, but his pen dangled loose, untouched. "Can I take your order?" His tone was flat, clipped, already impatient. Edward offered him a small, polite smile. "Just some soup, please. And maybe some water." The words were simple, but they carried a careful weight, as though Edward wanted to make sure he was asking for no more than he was allowed. He folded his hands together on the table, waiting. Jason didn't move to write it down. Instead, his eyes flicked from the old man's jacket to the cap folded neatly by his plate. His lip curled slightly, the beginnings of a smirk. "Soup's $5.90, he said, his voice louder than necessary. "You got money for that?" The sentence landed like a dropped glass. Conversations at nearby tables faltered. A woman 2 booths over lowered her fork, her eyes darting toward the exchange. A man at the counter stiffened, but kept his gaze on the coffee cup in his hand. The air in the diner tightened, the easy rhythm suddenly disrupted. Edward's smile wavered, but did not vanish. He reached slowly for his pocket, the movement deliberate. "Yes, I have money," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I wouldn't have asked otherwise." Jason raised his eyebrows as though unconvinced. He shifted his weight, still not writing anything on the pad. The sound of plates from the kitchen, the faint hiss of eggs on the griddle, all seemed to fade into the background. The focus of the diner narrowed to this small table, where dignity was being weighed in front of strangers. Keanu sat in the corner, his hat still low, mug resting between his hands. He had been still before, but now his head lifted just slightly. His gaze, sharp and clear, fixed on Jason and the old man. He didn't speak, didn't shift in his seat, but something in his posture changed. The kind of change invisible to most, but undeniable to those who noticed. Edward waited for Jason's reply, his hands folded again, steadying themselves on the table. His dignity remained, but the silence of the room pressed down heavier than before. Jason tapped the pen against his order pad without writing a word. He leaned slightly closer to Edward, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Just checking," he said, with a smirk that made clear his words weren't genuine concern. "We get all kinds in here. Never know who's going to walk through the door." Edward didn't flinch, though the muscles around his eyes tightened. His hands, resting on the table, bore the marks of years spent in work, knuckles broad, veins prominent, skin rough from labor that few in the room could imagine. He looked up at Jason calmly, answering with the same patience he had used all his life. "I understand, but I'll pay for my meal." The quiet dignity in his tone made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. A young mother at the next table tried to distract her children with questions about school, her voice a little too bright, a little too forced. The father glanced toward the scene, then quickly back down to his plate. It was easier not to get involved. Jason sighed theatrically, still refusing to write anything down. He gestured around the room with a lazy sweep of his hand. "We're busy. Might be a while before the soup's ready. You sure you don't want to try somewhere else? Somewhere better suited?" The implication hung heavy in the air. A couple at the counter exchanged glances. The woman's lips pressed tight, as if she wanted to say something, but the man beside her gave a small shake of his head. Silence prevailed. Edward's shoulders curved inward just slightly, but he did not lower his eyes. "That's all right," he said softly. "I can wait." In the corner booth, Keanu's grip around his mug tightened. He set it down slowly, the faint sound of ceramic against wood carrying farther than expected. His gaze remained fixed on the interaction, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Jason shrugged, uninterested in hiding his dismissal. One soup, when the kitchen gets around to it. He spun on his heel and strode toward a newly seated group of grade, well-dressed patrons, his smile suddenly broad, his tone full of warmth. "Welcome to the sunrise, folks. What can I get started for you today?" The contrast was sharp, obvious to everyone. Edward sat quietly, his cap folded on the table, his hands resting on the surface, trembling faintly now. He stared at the empty space before him, waiting. He had worked too many years to allow one young man's disdain to unravel him, yet the humiliation pricked like a thorn. The diner's hum resumed slowly, but it carried a new weight. People went back to their meals, their conversations. But each bite, each word, felt dulled by what they had witnessed. The silence they had chosen pressed heavier than Jason's insult. And still, from the corner booth, Keanu Reeves watched. He did not move, he did not speak, but the change in him was undeniable. Minutes passed. The diner's rhythm returned, though not entirely. The scrape of forks and the murmur of voices rose again, but an undercurrent lingered, an awareness that something had shifted. Edward remained still, his patience wrapping around him like armor. He glanced once toward the counter where the cook moved quickly behind the window, ladling broth, sliding plates across to servers. His soup was not there. Jason passed his table twice more, both times with a tray of drinks or plates meant for others. Each time, he avoided Edward's gaze. Each time, the humiliation pressed deeper, not through words now, but through absence. The refusal to serve promptly was its own cruelty, quieter yet cutting all the same. At the next table, a young woman glanced over, her lips parting as if to speak. But the moment dissolved when Jason appeared with fresh plates for the family across the aisle. She lowered her eyes quickly, ashamed of her own silence. Edward folded his hands together again, steadying them. The tremor in his fingers betrayed him, but his voice, when he finally spoke to no one in particular, carried its familiar dignity. "I can wait," he whispered. The words were barely audible, but those nearest heard them. They cut sharper than if he had shouted. At the counter, the owner, Mike Wheeler, lifted his head. His brows furrowed, but he remained in place, as though hoping the storm might pass without intervention. Business first, confrontation later. That had always been his way. Across the room, Keanu's posture shifted. For the first time, he leaned forward in his booth, resting both forearms on the table. His eyes, sharp and intent, never left Edward. He could feel the injustice hanging in the air like smoke, settling over every table. The stillness around him deepened, heavy with unspoken decision. Jason finally appeared again, this time with a bowl of soup in one hand, no tray to balance it properly. He set it down with a thud that splashed broth over the edge, staining the table. He didn't apologize. He only asked, his tone mocking, "Anything else?" Edward looked up, his face calm despite the sting. "Thank you," he said softly. "A spoon, if you don't mind." Jason patted his pockets theatrically. "Don't have one on me. I'll grab one when I get a chance." Then he turned away, already focused on the next table. The old man's hands stilled on the table, waiting again. His dignity remained, but the cracks in the moment were clear. Around him, no one spoke. No one intervened. Yet in the far corner, Keanu Reeves lifted his gaze fully for the first time, his eyes unwavering on the scene before him. The silence in his stillness carried more weight than words. Jason returned to Edward's table after several long minutes, his movements unhurried, almost theatrical. The bowl of soup had already cooled slightly from its rough delivery, but he made no effort to correct it. He leaned against the edge of the table, order pad still untouched, as if the interaction wasn't worth the ink. His smirk was back, sharper now, and he let it linger just long enough for nearby patrons to notice. "Funny seeing you here again," he said, his tone light but laced with condescension. "Last time you came in, didn't you just sit for hours with nothing but coffee? Thought you were making the place a waiting room." The words carried easily across the room. Forks paused midair. A father at the counter coughed awkwardly and reached for his napkin. A mother 2 tables over adjusted her daughter's chair, deliberately distracting her. The laughter from the young couple by the window faded, leaving only a tense quiet in its wake. Edward's eyes lowered for a moment, his hand brushing the rim of the soup bowl. The faint tremor in his fingers betrayed him, though his voice remained calm when he replied. "That was a different day. Today I've ordered my meal, and I'll pay for it." Jason chuckled, shaking his head slightly, as if the man's answer amused him. Sure, just saying. Some folks come in here and treat it like a free lounge. Can't be too careful, you know? The old man didn't rise to the bait. He folded his hands carefully on the table, steadying them against the wood. I understand, he said softly, but I'm here for soup today. The silence around them thickened. A woman across the aisle bit her lip, visibly uncomfortable. The man with her shifted in his seat, half turning toward the scene before forcing himself back to his plate. Everyone heard the words. No one said a thing. At the far corner booth, Keanu Reeves placed his coffee mug down slowly. The faint sound of ceramic against the wooden table seemed louder than it should have been. His eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, never left the exchange. He didn't move forward, didn't intervene, but the subtle gesture spoke volumes to anyone observant enough to notice. His stillness wasn't passive, it was deliberate. Jason either didn't notice or chose to ignore the growing unease in the room. He adjusted his apron and glanced at the clock above the counter. Well, don't get too comfortable, he added, his tone loud enough to reach every corner. Busy time of day. Don't want anyone sitting here too long for just one bowl of soup. Edward's back straightened slightly. His lips pressed together in a firm line, but his dignity remained intact. His voice, though quiet, cut through the still air. I'll eat quickly. I won't be in the way. The old man's restraint only deepened the tension. The room's silence felt heavier now, pressing against the walls, waiting for something to break it. Edward reached for his spoon at last, dipping it gently into the bowl before him. The broth rippled, steam rising faintly, but his hand trembled enough that the spoon clinked against the side of the bowl. He steadied himself quickly, determined not to show the weakness that Jason had tried to expose. His eyes remained calm, but the weight of humiliation pressed down all the same. From the next table, a teenage boy glanced at Edward with wide eyes, but when his mother caught his gaze, she quickly redirected him back to his plate. Families carried their discomfort quietly, hoping the moment would pass without drawing them in. Yet every person felt the sting, whether they admitted it aloud or not. Jason returned after a short while, holding 2 plates meant for another table, but he stopped again at Edward's booth. He leaned down, lowering his voice so it seemed private, though it was clear he wanted others nearby to overhear. You know, you really ought to order more if you're going to sit here during lunch rush. Minimum purchase and all that. Soup doesn't really cut it. There was no such policy, but Jason said it smoothly, as though it were fact. Edward's hand stilled halfway to his mouth. His shoulders lifted slightly, then settled again as he forced himself to keep steady. If I need to, I'll order more, he said, voice even but soft. I didn't know there was such a rule. Jason shrugged, straightening up with a sly grin. Well, now you know. Don't say I didn't warn you. He walked off toward the counter, delivering the plates with a smile so broad it was almost mocking. The tension in the diner thickened. A woman at the counter shifted uncomfortably, catching Mike Wheeler's eye as though urging him to intervene. But Mike busied himself with paperwork, avoiding the weight of responsibility. Edward tried again with his spoon, bringing a small portion to his lips. His hand steadied just enough to complete the gesture, though his grip on the utensil was tight. He was determined not to let the situation strip him of the simple act of eating. But even as he swallowed, his throat tightened with the knowledge that half the diner was watching. In the far booth, Keanu's stillness grew sharper. He shifted only enough to lace his fingers together on the table, his mug set aside. His gaze remained locked on Edward, every detail taken in the trembling hands, the steady voice, the forced composure. Keanu's jaw tightened slightly, though he kept his calm. He knew the moment was building. He could feel the edge of it, like a storm waiting to break. Jason passed by once more, balancing drinks for the well-dressed family near the window. As he moved past Edward's table, he let his voice carry just a little too far. Careful you don't fall asleep again like last time. Soup gets cold fast. The jab struck deeper than before, sharpened by memory. Edward's lips parted, then closed again. His composure wavered, but his voice, when it came, remained steady. That was another day, he repeated, his dignity refusing to bend. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. The insult had been sharp, deliberate, and Jason delivered it without hesitation. For a moment, the clinking of forks and the shuffle of plates seemed to vanish entirely, as though the entire diner were holding its breath. Edward lowered his spoon gently, resting it back inside the bowl. His hands trembled faintly, not from weakness alone, but from the strain of enduring such public humiliation. He placed both palms flat on the table, steadying himself against the invisible weight pressing on his chest. His eyes remained lifted, not defiant, but resolute. A man who refused to bow, though the world around him gave him every reason to. A man at the counter muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. His wife reached over, placing a hand on his arm to quiet him. The young couple by the window exchanged uneasy glances, but neither spoke. Silence had become the safer choice, even if it tasted bitter. Jason lingered just long enough to enjoy the stillness he had created before striding back toward the counter with exaggerated confidence. His laughter mixed with the hum of the grill, though no one else joined him. The other patrons sat rigid, their guilt reflected in the way their eyes avoided Edward's table. Keanu Reeves moved then, not much, but enough to draw invisible attention. He reached for his mug again, lifting it with deliberate calm. He held it for a moment, as though considering whether to drink, then lowered it back to the table with a quiet, controlled click. The sound wasn't loud, but in the hush that filled the diner, it echoed. Heads turned subtly, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. Edward looked down at his cap resting on the table, his fingers brushing against its brim. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, drawing strength from somewhere deep within. When he opened, "Eye them again," his voice carried across the table, soft but unwavering. "I will finish my soup," he said, as if promising it to himself more than to anyone else. The room stirred faintly. Conversations tried to restart, but they stumbled, never regaining their rhythm. No one missed the fact that the old man's dignity stood taller than Jason's cruelty. The discomfort of the silence was no longer about Edward alone. It was about the rest of them, their complicity in watching without speaking. From his corner booth, Keanu's gaze sharpened. He had seen enough. The small gesture of placing his mug down had been the signal. He would not remain still much longer. For Edward, the tremor in his hands was only a small crack in the armor of his spirit. His voice, though quiet, had never faltered. But for the diner, the moment had widened into something larger. Everyone felt the imbalance. Everyone knew it had gone too far. The first humiliation had been delivered. The silence that followed was its own kind of wound. And in that silence, Keanu Reeves prepared to rise. Jason returned from the counter with the bowl of soup balanced carelessly in one hand, his order pad tucked under his arm. The bowl wobbled as he moved, broth sloshing near the rim. By the time he reached Edward's table, a thin line of liquid had already spilled onto the saucer beneath. He set it down with a dull thud, enough to splash drops across the table's surface. "There you go," he said flatly, making no attempt to wipe the mess. Edward's eyes lowered to the bowl. A small puddle had gathered near the spoon rest, but the spoon itself was missing. He lifted his gaze with quiet patience. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Could I have a spoon, please?" Jason tapped his pad against his palm, smirking faintly. "Kitchen must have forgotten. You'll get one when I've got time." The words were dismissive, casual, but the sarcasm carried. A couple at the counter turned slightly, pretending to adjust their stools, though it was clear they were listening. The young mother with 2 children shifted uncomfortably, pulling her kids closer, whispering something to keep their attention away. Edward nodded slowly, his dignity intact. "I understand," he said. His voice held no anger, only a calm persistence. "I'll wait." Jason rolled his eyes and turned away without another word. His posture radiated impatience, his strides longer than necessary as he moved back toward the counter. The diner's atmosphere thickened again. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen tried to fill the silence, but the tension bled into every corner. It wasn't just about soup anymore. It was about the cruelty of withholding something so simple, so basic, from a man who asked only with respect. Edward folded his hands on the table, steadying himself. His fingers trembled faintly, though his back remained straight. He looked at the soup, steam curling upward, so close and yet unreachable. He made no complaint, no sigh, only waited. From the corner booth, Keanu Reeves watched. His fingers tightened around his mug, his knuckles whitening for just a moment before easing again. He kept his face angled downward, his hat still casting a shadow, but his eyes never left the scene. Every detail registered the way Jason's dismissal cut through the old man's patience, the silence of the crowd, the humiliation written not in shouts, but in small, deliberate acts. A minute passed, then two. Edward remained still, but his patience was becoming a test not of endurance, but of spirit. At last, he raised his head slightly, catching Jason as he passed again. "Excuse me," he said, just as politely as before. "When you have a moment, may I please have that spoon?" Jason stopped, tilted his head as if deciding whether to bother, then pulled a spoon from his apron pocket. He dropped it onto the table with a sharp clink, metal against wood. It spun slightly before settling, near the edge, dangerously close to falling off. "There," Jason said. "Happy now?" Edward's hands trembled again as he reached for it, but his voice remained steady. "Thank you." The exchange, small as it seemed, rippled through the diner like a crack, spreading across glass. Edward steadied the spoon in his hand, careful not to let it slip. He dipped it into the soup, drawing a small portion toward his lips. The broth was lukewarm, no longer steaming, but he did not complain. He swallowed with deliberate calm, as if determined to prove that even in humiliation, he could endure with dignity. At a nearby booth, an older woman shifted uneasily. She pressed her hands together in her lap, her face lined with conflict. Her husband, seated across from her, gave the slightest shake of his head, a silent plea to let it go. The woman sighed and returned to her pancakes, though each bite felt heavy with guilt. Jason passed by again, carrying a tray of drinks for a group of college students who had just come in. His voice grew louder, cheerier, dripping with enthusiasm. "Welcome, folks. Glad to have you here today. Best burgers in town and fries are half price." His laugh rang out across the diner, too loud, too practiced. The contrast was stark. Edward sat with his modest bowl of soup, eating quietly, while Jason lavished attention on anyone who appeared more profitable. The unfairness was plain, yet no one spoke. Their silence pressed on the walls, trapping the scene in a kind of collective shame. Edward paused after a few spoonfuls, setting the utensil gently on the saucer. His hands rested again on the table, fingers curling slightly to keep the tremor hidden. He looked around the diner, not accusing, not pleading, simply observing. His gaze passed over the young couple, the construction workers at the counter, the family with children. None met his eyes. Still, he offered no bitterness. His posture remained straight, his voice calm when he spoke again. "Thank you for bringing the spoon," he said softly toward the direction Jason had gone, though the waiter didn't acknowledge him. From the corner booth, Keanu Reeves shifted his shoulders, the movement subtle but filled with restrained tension. He adjusted his hat slightly, the brim lifting just enough to reveal the intensity of his gaze. His mug remained untouched now, forgotten, as his focus narrowed entirely to the old man. Jason returned moments later, collecting plates from a table near Edward. As he leaned across, he accidentally nudged Edward's table, sending a ripple through the soup. A few drops splashed over the rim, trailing across the surface. Jason didn't apologize. Instead, he gave a crooked grin. "Careful there. Don't want to make a mess." Edward's hand moved quickly to steady the bowl. His fingers pressed against the cool ceramic, holding it firm. He looked up slowly, meeting Jason's eyes for the first time since the exchange began. His own eyes were steady, calm, though faintly shadowed with sadness. "I'll manage," he said simply. The restraint in his voice struck harder than anger would have. Around the diner, forks hovered mid-air. Conversations paused. Hearts beat a little faster. It was clear that something in this small moment was building toward a breaking point. Keanu's grip on the edge of his table tightened again. His patience remained, but the silence he carried was heavy. deliberate, waiting for the right moment. Jason stacked the empty plates from another table and glanced back at Edward's booth with deliberate slowness. He smirked faintly, as though daring the old man to complain. Edward, however, kept his focus on the soup before him, spoon moving steadily, though his hand shook faintly with each lift. Every gesture was deliberate, every swallow an act of perseverance. The room felt taut, like a string pulled too tight. The families, couples, and workers who had once chatted easily now found their words harder to release. Each sound, the scrape of a fork, the clink of a coffee cup, felt sharp, brittle. No one said anything, yet their silence spoke loudly enough. Edward paused halfway through the bowl, his spoon resting on the edge. His hands folded lightly on the table, as if collecting himself. When Jason returned to clear another booth nearby, Edward lifted his gaze again. His voice was low but steady. "Young man, thank you for the soup. I appreciate it." The words were soft, sincere, offered without sarcasm. They carried across the tense air with surprising strength. A woman near the counter inhaled quietly, pressing her napkin to her mouth. The man beside her shifted, his jaw tightening. It wasn't anger they felt. It was the sting of seeing dignity held firm in the face of deliberate disrespect. Jason responded with a careless shrug. "Sure thing. Always glad to serve." His tone dripped with mockery, but his eyes darted quickly around the room, noticing how many had gone quiet. For the first time, a hint of unease flickered in him, though he covered it quickly with a grin. Edward lowered his eyes again, lifting the spoon for another sip. He did not fight back, did not return insult for insult. He simply ate, quietly, with the dignity that Jason could not take from him. The silence of the room now leaned toward Edward, not the waiter. Respect began to shift in unseen ways. In the corner, Keanu Reeves moved once more. His hand rested flat against the table, his other hand curling loosely around the mug he had left untouched. His grip tightened again, strong and unshakable, as though bracing himself. His face remained calm, but his eyes were alive with focus. The restraint was deliberate, yet it was clear to anyone who looked closely. The line was nearing its end. Jason dropped the collected dishes onto the counter with a clatter, his grin still plastered across his face. He didn't realize the atmosphere had already begun to change. Didn't realize that his cruelty was no longer invisible. Edward finished another spoonful and set the utensil gently against the saucer. He drew in a breath, steadying himself, and folded his hands once more. He had not lost his composure. The dignity he carried was unbroken. The diner, though silent, was no longer indifferent. And at the far corner, Keanu's silent readiness promised that indifference would not last. The diner's hum had nearly returned to its usual rhythm when Jason approached again. His steps were slower this time, his tray empty, his hands resting carelessly on his apron strings. He glanced toward Edward's table with a look that carried more disdain than duty. The smirk returned, curling at the edge of his mouth, as though he had been saving something crueler to say. "You know," Jason began, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the nearest booths, "there's a shelter downtown that serves free meals. Might be a better fit for you than here." The words sliced through the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. The scrape of cutlery stopped. The hum of the grill from the kitchen seemed suddenly distant. Edward sat frozen for a heartbeat, his spoon resting in the bowl, his hands folded gently on the table. His lips pressed together, his face composed, but the tremor in his fingers betrayed the effort it took to keep steady. He lifted his gaze toward Jason, his eyes calm but heavy with quiet disappointment. "I paid for my meal," he said softly. His voice, though low, reached the ears of those nearby with clarity. "I belong here as much as anyone." Jason shrugged, rolling his eyes in a performance meant for the crowd. "If you say so. Just don't expect people to roll out the red carpet. Diners, not charity." The words landed heavily. A man at the counter shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. A young woman near the window shook her head subtly, but neither spoke. Their silence weighed on them, yet fear of making a scene kept their voices locked inside. Edward's hand slipped toward his jacket pocket. He reached inside slowly, pulling out a worn leather wallet that had seen better years. From it, he withdrew a few folded bills, carefully smoothing them against the table with trembling hands. He placed them neatly beside the bowl of half-eaten soup, the green of the bills stark against the white surface. He did not touch the bowl. Soup again. He did not lift the spoon. Instead, he pushed the bowl slightly away from him, a gesture that spoke louder than protest. It was the quiet decision of a man who had had enough, a man who would rather walk away than endure further shame. "I won't stay where I'm not welcome," Edward said quietly. His words were not sharp, not bitter. They were filled with resignation, the tone of someone who had fought too many silent battles and chosen, once more, to step aside with dignity. The diner shifted uncomfortably. Patrons looked at one another, guilt reflected in lowered eyes and clenched jaws. The weight of silence pressed thicker, suffocating. Everyone knew the wrong had gone too far, yet no one rose. From the corner booth, a different sound finally stirred. Keanu Reeves pushed his chair back. The scrape of wood against tile cut through the heavy quiet like a blade, sharp and commanding. Every head turned. The smirk faded from Jason's face. The room, caught in its breath, waited. The sound of Keanu's chair legs dragging across the tile was not loud, yet it carried with the weight of finality. It froze the room in a way no sharp rebuke ever could. Those who had been averting their eyes now found themselves staring at him, instinctively sensing that something was about to shift. Keanu did not rise immediately. For a moment, he sat with his hands on the table, one of them still resting near the empty coffee mug, the other steady on the booth's edge. He inhaled slowly, as though measuring the moment, as though considering the silence that had thickened around Edward. Then, with deliberate calm, he stood. The sunlight pouring through the windows caught his face as he straightened, the brim of his hat still low but not enough to conceal who he was. Whispers rippled through the diner, hushed but undeniable. Recognition moved from table to table like a current, electrifying the still air. Jason noticed it first, and his smirk faltered. He blinked, stepping back almost instinctively, as if realizing that the balance of power in the room had changed without a word being spoken. Edward, unaware at first of what was happening behind him, was still collecting his wallet, carefully tucking it back into his jacket pocket. He moved with the slow precision of someone who had lived through years of discipline, of hardship endured without complaint. His intention was clear. He would leave before pride was stripped from him entirely. But Keanu's presence had already shifted the room. Patrons who had stayed silent moments earlier leaned forward, their curiosity overcoming their hesitation. A young boy at a nearby booth tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering too loudly, "Mom, that's Keanu Reeves." She hushed him quickly, but her eyes remained fixed on the tall figure standing in the corner. Keanu's gaze never wavered. It was directed squarely at Jason, the young waiter whose arrogance now seemed suddenly fragile under the weight of that calm, unflinching stare. Jason opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but the words caught. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, the silence pressing down harder with every second. Edward rose slowly from his chair, his legs unsteady but his dignity intact. He did not look at Jason. He did not look at anyone else in the diner. Instead, he turned toward the door, his hand brushing the brim of his hat, as if preparing to retreat into the anonymity of the street. But the scrape of Keanu's chair had stopped him as well. He paused, his weathered face turning slightly to glance at the corner booth. His expression was puzzled, almost questioning, as if unsure whether the man standing there had truly risen on his behalf. The diner held its collective breath. The tension was no longer just between Edward and Jason. It had grown larger, heavier, as though the entire town's soul was suspended on the edge of what would happen next. Keanu Reeves stepped forward. Keanu's steps were unhurried, each one deliberate, as though he wanted the sound of his boots against the diner floor to mark the moment. The room stayed hushed, every eye following his progress. The faint clink of cutlery and the low hum of the kitchen had faded into silence, leaving only the sound of his steady approach. Jason shifted his weight, his bravado slipping further with each step Keanu took. He tried to force a grin, tried to shake off the tension by glancing toward the better-dressed patrons as if hoping for support. But no one returned his look. They were watching the tall man in the dark jacket, the man whose quiet presence carried more authority than any raised voice could. Edward still stood beside his table, his weathered hands resting on the back of the chair. He glanced from Jason to Keanu, his brow furrowed in confusion. He hadn't expected anyone to intervene. For so long he had grown used to silence, to enduring small cruelties without defense. The idea that someone might stand beside him seemed almost foreign. Keanu stopped near Edward's table. He didn't speak yet. He simply placed one hand lightly on the back of the chair Edward had vacated, as if anchoring himself to the moment. His presence alone seemed to command the room. Jason finally broke the silence. "Look, it's not a big deal," he said quickly, his voice a little higher than before. He was leaving anyway. The words came out thin, defensive, lacking the swagger he had used only minutes earlier. Edward's lips tightened, but he said nothing. He kept his posture straight, refusing to allow Jason the satisfaction of seeing him falter further. Keanu's gaze remained steady, unwavering. He didn't need to respond right away. His silence carried weight, the kind that made Jason shift uncomfortably and left the rest of the diner waiting, expectant. Then, slowly, Keanu turned his eyes from Jason to Edward. His expression softened, carrying none of the contempt that had been hurled at the older man. Instead, it was filled with something different: recognition, respect, and quiet solidarity. The diner's atmosphere had changed. What had begun as an old man's humiliation had grown into something far more profound. The choice now stood before everyone: continue in silence or acknowledge the dignity that had been trampled. Edward lowered his gaze for a moment, staring at the folded bills still lying on the table. He had been ready to walk out, ready to leave behind his meal, ready to retreat into the invisible world where men like him were often pushed. But the sound of Keanu's chair, the weight of his presence, told him he wasn't as alone as he believed. Keanu's hand tightened slightly on the back of the chair. It was not anger that radiated from him, but conviction, a quiet resolve that promised the next moment would be different. The entire diner seemed to lean forward, waiting to see what would happen when he finally spoke. When the silence was broken at last, the breaking point had arrived. Keanu's hand lingered on the chair, the tension in the diner thick enough to silence every whisper. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, he reached for his hat. His fingers brushed the brim, and he lifted it from his head. The simple act carried a gravity no one expected. The dim light from the diner's wide windows fell across his face, no longer obscured by shadow. Gasps rippled quietly through the booths. Recognition spread like wildfire, first in whispers, then in hushed exclamations that carried across the room. "That's Keanu Reeves," a teenager near the counter murmured, her eyes wide, clutching at her mother's sleeve. "No way," a man in a business suit whispered under his breath, leaning forward as if he couldn't trust his own sight. But there was no mistaking it. The man who had been quietly sitting in the corner, nursing his coffee with no desire for attention, was indeed one of the most recognizable faces in the world. And yet, at this moment, he wasn't a movie star. He was something more. Keanu Reeves set his hat gently on the table, his movements calm, unhurried. He began to walk forward, each step measured, deliberate, as though he wanted the weight of his presence to be felt without ever raising his voice. His long strides carried him steadily toward Edward and Jason, and with every step, the air in the diner seemed to tighten. Jason faltered immediately. His posture stiffened, his smirk vanishing in an instant. The arrogance he had worn so confidently slipped away, replaced by confusion and a growing panic. He looked around for support, but none of the patrons returned his glance. All eyes were on Keanu. The room had turned, and Jason stood alone. Edward, still holding the back of his chair for balance, turned to face the approaching figure. His expression shifted from confusion to quiet shock. He blinked, almost in disbelief, recognizing the man walking toward him but struggling to understand why someone like Keanu Reeves would intervene on his behalf. Keanu's eyes were steady, unwavering, as he stopped beside the table. His presence carried no hostility, no bluster, only calm authority, the kind that could silence cruelty without raising a hand. Jason swallowed hard, his throat tight, his eyes darting nervously between Edward and Keanu. The silence stretched, unbearable for him, but Keanu did not rush to fill it. He let the weight of his presence settle, let Jason feel the burden of his own actions pressing against him from every direction. Finally, Keanu spoke. His voice was soft, almost quiet, yet it cut through the air like thunder. "Is there a problem here?" The question was simple, almost gentle, but it carried with it a gravity that could not be ignored. The silence following Keanu's words stretched long, as if the very walls of the diner had paused to listen. His tone wasn't sharp, not threatening, but it carried an unmistakable weight. It was the kind of voice that left no room for lies, the kind that reached past bravado and pierced straight into conscience. Jason's jaw tightened. He tried to force a shrug, to make it seem like he hadn't just humiliated a man in front of a room full of witnesses, but the swagger that had carried him minutes ago was gone. His lips parted, and his words stumbled out with far less confidence than before. "No problem," Jason said quickly, his voice higher, thinner. "Just handling a customer situation." A murmur passed through the diner. Patrons exchanged looks, their earlier discomfort hardening into disapproval. They had seen everything. They knew what Jason had done. No one bought his excuse. Keanu didn't move. He simply tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked on Jason with a calmness that felt more powerful than anger. "A customer situation?" he repeated softly, as if testing the words. Jason's cheeks flushed. He fidgeted with the order pad in his hand, tapping the edge against his leg. "Yeah, he was leaving anyway." He gestured awkwardly toward Edward, who still stood beside the table, quiet but unyielding in his dignity. Edward raised his chin slowly, his weathered face steady. His voice, though soft, carried through the quiet room. "I wasn't leaving because I wanted to," he said. "I was leaving because I was made to feel like I didn't belong." The words landed heavier than anything Jason could have said. Heads nodded subtly across the diner. Small signs of agreement, of guilt, of recognition. Edward had spoken for all of them. Keanu's eyes flickered briefly to Edward, then returned to Jason. His voice remained calm, but the authority in it deepened. This man ordered food, he paid for it, and yet he was treated as if he had no place here. "Tell me, is that your policy?" Jason's mouth opened, then shut again. His eyes darted toward the counter, where Mike Wheeler, the diner's owner, stood frozen. Mike's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence an indictment of its own. The room stayed hushed, the weight of Keanu's words settling into every corner. Even children who didn't understand the details sensed something important unfolding, their wide eyes fixed on the tall figure standing beside the old man's table. Jason shifted his weight, muttering defensively, "I was just making sure he could pay." Keanu leaned slightly forward, his voice still soft but sharpened with quiet steel. "You didn't make sure. You humiliated him." The words struck like a blow, not loud but undeniable. Jason flinched as if the truth itself was heavier than anything he had carried before. The room seemed to lean closer, waiting. Keanu's words had struck the truth bare, and Jason had nowhere left to hide. The young waiter shifted uneasily, his order pad trembling slightly in his hand. His eyes darted to the kitchen, to the counter, to anywhere but the man standing calmly before him. Edward remained still beside the table, his wallet tucked back into his jacket. He had not touched the money on the table, nor the soup growing cold before him. His hands gripped the chair lightly, and though his frame seemed frail, his dignity stood taller, now under Keanu's shield of quiet strength. Jason cleared his throat, forcing out a laugh that fell flat in the silent diner. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. His words meant more for himself than anyone else. "People come in here all the time, trying to..." He stopped, realizing, even as he spoke, that his excuses held no weight under the steady eyes watching him from every corner. Keanu straightened slightly, his presence filling the space without force. His gaze never wavered, and when he spoke again, the softness remained, but so did the edge of conviction. "Everyone deserves respect," he said. "It costs nothing. But when you take it away from someone, you take more than you realize." The words carried deeper than the air inside the diner. Patrons shifted in their seats, shame flickering across their faces as they recalled their silence earlier. Some bowed their heads, others clenched their jaws. They knew they had sat by and done nothing, and Keanu's quiet truth was as much for them as it was for Jason. Jason's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. His hands fumbled at his apron, his lips pressed tightly together, but he did not answer. The bravado that once defined him was gone, replaced by something raw fear, perhaps, or the first spark of realization. Edward finally looked at Keanu, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For a moment, he seemed as though he might speak, but no words came. Instead, he gave a small nod, acknowledging the man who had stepped into his silence and given him back his dignity. Keanu turned his gaze to Edward then, softening further. "You don't have to leave," he said simply. The gentleness in his voice was a balm against the cruelty that had lingered only minutes earlier. The diner held its collective breath, waiting for what would happen next. Jason stood frozen, the room's eyes burning against him, the weight of Keanu's words sinking into his chest. And Edward, though weary, straightened his shoulders slightly, feeling for the first time, that afternoon, that he was no longer invisible. The tide in the room had shifted. With just a question, spoken softly but with unshakable conviction, Keanu Reeves had turned humiliation into reckoning. The diner was silent, every ear straining, every eye watching. Jason stood stiffly, his order pad useless in his hand. Keanu's steady gaze never wavered. The moment stretched, filled with the weight of what would happen next. Then Keanu spoke again, his voice low but clear. "Bring this man a fresh bowl of soup," he said, gesturing toward Edward, "and a sandwich." The words were calm, not barked or shouted, but they carried such authority that no one mistook them for a request. The tone was final, leaving no space for refusal. Jason blinked rapidly, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting nervously to the counter where Mike Wheeler, the owner, still stood rooted in place. His instinct to resist pushed against the rising pressure of the room. "We're busy," Jason said, his voice breaking slightly as he tried to recover his earlier confidence. "The kitchen's backed up. It'll take a while." Keanu did not move. His hands rested easily at his sides, his posture relaxed, yet the quiet firmness in his eyes made Jason's excuses shrivel before they even left his lips. "A fresh bowl of soup," Keanu repeated. His voice had not risen, but something in the way he spoke made it impossible to ignore. Then, after a pause, he added, "And a sandwich, on a clean table." The emphasis was subtle, but it pressed down like a weight. Jason faltered, his jaw tightening, his lips pressing together in frustration. He opened his mouth as though to argue, but the silence of the diner pressed against him. The patrons were no longer passive. They were witnesses, waiting to see whether he would obey or defy. Edward lifted a hand slightly, his voice calm, though a trace of discomfort lingered. "That isn't necessary," he said. "I don't need special treatment. I just came for soup, nothing more." Keanu turned to him, and the steel in his eyes softened instantly. His voice carried warmth, gentleness, but it held to the same unyielding truth. "It's not special treatment," he said. "It's the respect everyone deserves." The words cut through the air like a clean blade. A few patrons nodded instinctively, their guilt pressing heavier now. They had seen the cruelty. They had sat in silence. And Keanu had voiced the truth. They had been too afraid to speak. Jason clenched his order pad so tightly the cardboard bent against his palm. His defiance weakened with every second he stood there under Keanu's gaze. The diner had already chosen sides. From behind the counter, Mike Wheeler finally stepped forward. He cleared his throat, his voice rough but firm. "Jason," he said, his tone carrying the final push of authority. "Do as he says." Jason's lips parted in protest, but the look from Mike Wheeler cut him off before a single word escaped. The authority of the diner's owner, combined with Keanu's calm command, left him standing bare, stripped of the false confidence he had worn earlier. His face flushed red, and he gave a stiff nod, muttering something under his breath that no one cared to catch. Turning on his heel, he stalked toward the kitchen, pushing the swinging door harder than necessary, as if the clatter could win back the dignity he had lost. But the gesture fell flat. The room had already judged him. His arrogance was gone, and what remained was the bitter aftertaste of shame. As the kitchen door flapped closed behind him, the silence lingered. It wasn't empty silence, it was charged, filled with the collective breath of people who had witnessed something powerful. No one dared return to their meals yet. Every eye was still locked on the corner of the diner where Edward stood beside his untouched soup and Keanu remained by his side. Edward looked down at the folded bills on the table, then slowly back up at Keanu. His voice was low, carrying the careful dignity of a man who had lived through far worse than embarrassment. "I don't want to be a burden," he said. "I can eat what's already here. I can manage." Keanu shook his head gently. His expression softened in a way that disarmed everyone watching. "You're not a burden," he said. "You've paid for your meal. And more than that, you've earned respect. That's not extra. That's not charity. That's the bare minimum every person deserves." The words spread through the diner like ripples across still water. Patrons exchanged glances, some bowing their heads, others staring down at their plates. The quiet sting of guilt pressed against them, because they knew he wasn't just talking to Jason. He was talking to all of them. Edward's weathered eyes glistened faintly, though he kept his composure. He gave the smallest nod, as though Keanu's assurance had restored something inside him that had been chipped away by humiliation. At the counter, Fran, the veteran waitress, wiped at a glass with a towel, her movements steady but her expression telling. She had worked in the diner longer than anyone, had seen customers come and go, kindness given and kindness withheld. And in that moment, even she leaned slightly forward, as if grateful someone had spoken the truth aloud. The kitchen door swung open again, and Jason emerged with stiff shoulders, carrying a tray. On it sat a steaming bowl of soup, a thick sandwich stacked neatly on fresh bread, and a glass of water filled to the brim. His hands trembled slightly as he walked, and though his face was carefully blank, the tension in his jaw betrayed the battle inside him. Every eye followed him as he approached the corner booth again. Jason reached the table, setting the tray down with far more care than he had shown earlier. The soup did not slosh this time. The sandwich sat perfectly centered on the plate. The glass of water barely rippled as he lowered it. He lingered for a moment, gripping the edge of the tray as though unsure what to do next. His eyes flickered to Keanu, then to Edward. For the first time that day, there was no mockery in them, no smirk or superiority, only unease, only the faint recognition that his behavior had been laid bare for all to see. Keanu inclined his head slightly toward the food, then looked back at Jason. The unspoken message was clear: serve with respect, or not at all. Jason swallowed hard and forced himself to nod. Then, without another word, he stepped back, retreating toward the kitchen like a shadow fading into the background. Edward looked down at the fresh meal before him. Steam curled upward from the bowl, carrying the comforting scent of broth and vegetables. The sandwich, thick and hearty, seemed almost too generous for what he had asked for. His weathered hands hovered uncertainly over the table. "I didn't need all this," he murmured, his voice breaking slightly. "I just wanted soup." Keanu placed a gentle hand on the back of the chair Edward had been ready to abandon moments before. His voice was steady, yet softened with warmth. "It's not about what you need," he said. "It's about what you deserve, and you deserve this much and more." The old man blinked, fighting back emotion that threatened to spill over. He lowered himself slowly back into the chair, his movements deliberate, his dignity intact. He folded his hands briefly in his lap, then picked up the spoon with a steadier grip than before. The diner breathed again. Patrons began to move, to whisper, to exchange glances heavy with reflection. Some nodded faintly, others looked down at their meals, ashamed of their silence earlier. The atmosphere had shifted. What had begun as humiliation had become a lesson no one in that room would forget. Mike Wheeler stepped closer to the table now, his hands clasped in front of him. His voice was lower than usual, almost hesitant. "Mr. Conroy," he said, using the name he'd overheard earlier, "this meal is on the house, and I'll see to it personally that you're treated the way you should be from here on." Edward's lips pressed into a thin line, touched by the gesture but unwilling to let go of his pride completely. "I didn't come for charity," he said firmly. Keanu turned to him, his eyes warm, his voice carrying the quiet conviction that had silenced the room. "This isn't charity," he said. "This is respect, and respect is never optional." The words settled into the hearts of everyone present. Fran nodded subtly from the counter. The family at the nearby booth shifted uncomfortably, their shame written on their faces. Even Jason, standing stiffly in the kitchen doorway, could not escape the weight of it. Edward lifted the spoon, took his first bite, and let out a quiet sigh. For the first time that afternoon, the lines of his face eased. He was not eating in humiliation anymore. He was eating in dignity. Edward sat quietly before the fresh soup and sandwich, the spoon trembling slightly in his hand, though his grip was steadier than before. The steam rose in gentle curls, carrying with it the scent of something more than food. It carried the dignity of being acknowledged, of being seen, of being respected. Yet Edward's eyes did not linger on the meal. They flicked toward Keanu, uncertain, almost hesitant. Keanu had not returned to his corner booth. He remained standing beside Edward's table, calm and steady, as if waiting for something more. His gaze softened when he met Edward's eyes. Then, in a voice that carried the same quiet authority he had used moments earlier, he spoke again. "Why don't you come sit with me?" he said. His hand lifted slightly, gesturing toward the booth in the far corner, where he had been sitting all morning. "I was having coffee alone. I could use some company." The offer hung in the air, unexpected. Patrons glanced at one another in surprise, their eyes widening. It was one thing for Keanu Reeves to stand up in defense of a man's dignity. It was another to invite that man to sit with him, to share his space, his table, his presence. Edward blinked, the spoon slipping gently back into the bowl as if his hand had lost strength. His lips parted, but for a moment, no sound came. His weathered face shifted between disbelief and humility. I couldn't," he said softly. "I don't want to impose." Keanu's expression didn't change. His voice remained steady, his eyes unwavering. "It's not an imposition," he said. "It's an invitation." The room, once again, was silent. All attention remained fixed on the corner, waiting to see how Edward would respond. The frail old man, dressed in worn but carefully tended clothes, stared at the movie star who spoke to him not as a celebrity, not as a benefactor, but as an equal. Edward's throat worked as he swallowed hard. Slowly, with visible effort, he pushed his chair back. He rose unsteadily to his feet, his hand gripping the edge of the table for balance. For a brief moment, it seemed he might sit back down, that the weight of pride and hesitation might hold him in place. But Keanu extended a hand, not forceful, not pulling, simply offering, and Edward accepted. The diner watched in silence as Keanu gently guided him across the floor toward the corner booth. The steps were slow, deliberate, but with each one, Edward's posture straightened slightly. It was not just the movement of a man walking to a new seat. It was the movement of a man being restored, step by step, in the eyes of everyone watching. When they reached the booth, Keanu gestured toward the seat opposite his own. "Please," he said, his voice low but filled with warmth. "Sit." Edward lowered himself carefully onto the bench. His hands rested briefly on the table as he gathered himself, then folded neatly in his lap. His gaze moved slowly across the diner, taking in the eyes fixed on him. For the first time since he had entered that morning, he did not lower his head in embarrassment. He met their stares with quiet steadiness, his dignity reflected in his posture. Keanu slid into the opposite seat, his movements calm and unhurried. Once seated, he glanced up at Jason, who had returned reluctantly to the dining floor. The young waiter's shoulders were slumped, his earlier arrogance gone. His face burned with shame under the weight of so many eyes. Keanu spoke clearly, his words directed at Jason. "Thank you for bringing this meal." The tone was pointed, not cruel, but deliberate, an unmistakable reminder of the respect that should have been there all along. Jason nodded stiffly, unable to meet his gaze. He muttered something close to acknowledgement, then retreated to the counter, where he busied himself with meaningless tasks to avoid the eyes still following him. Edward looked at Keanu across the table, his lips pressed together in a thin line. "I don't know why you'd sit with me," he said quietly, "but thank you." Keanu shook his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. "Don't thank me," he replied. "This is the way it should have been from the start." The corner booth, once unnoticed, now held the attention of the entire diner. Edward sat across from Keanu, his shoulders drawn back with a quiet dignity that had been restored. He glanced at the steaming bowl of soup and the thick sandwich in front of him, then back at the man seated opposite. His voice was careful, humble, but stronger than before. "You didn't have to do this," Edward said. "Most people would have let me walk out." Keanu folded his hands on the table, his expression calm but unyielding. "Maybe most people would, but that doesn't make it right." His words were spoken softly, yet they carried to every ear in the diner. Respect isn't earned by wealth or status. It belongs to everyone the moment they walk through that door. The truth of it settled into the silence, pressing against the consciences of those who had stayed quiet. Earlier, a man at the counter lowered his eyes, ashamed of how he had done nothing. A woman near the window clasped her child's hand a little tighter, silently promising herself to raise him differently. Edward lifted the spoon again, his grip steady now. He took a careful bite, then another. The warmth of the broth seemed to spread through him, not only in his body, but in his spirit. He set the spoon down for a moment, his voice quiet but resolute. "It's been a long time since someone made me feel like I belonged." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady and kind. "You always belonged. They just forgot to see it. Sometimes people need reminding." At the counter, Jason stood motionless, forced to hear every word. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by the sting of recognition. He had been the one to forget, the one who needed reminding. The booth carried no grandeur, no spotlight, yet it had become the center of something larger. Edward, who had entered the diner as a shadow, now sat in full view of everyone, not as a burden, but as a man among men. And Keanu Reeves, who had once sat quietly in his corner, had turned a simple meal into a lesson that none in that diner would forget. For the first time that morning, Edward smiled. Faintly. It wasn't wide, it wasn't forced, it was genuine. The quiet smile of someone who had been restored. And as he sat across from Keanu, sharing a booth, he no longer felt small, he felt seen. Edward sat across from Keanu in the booth, his spoon resting gently on the saucer now. His appetite slowed not by the food itself, but by the weight of memory pressing forward. His eyes, worn but steady, drifted toward the window, where sunlight cut across the floor in pale beams. The murmur of the diner returned in small threads around them, but at this booth, time felt paused. Keanu leaned back slightly, his expression patient, his gaze resting gently on the old man before him. He didn't rush, didn't prod, only waited with the kind of silence that invited truth to surface. Edward's hands folded together on the table, the tremor in them faint but noticeable. "I worked 42 years at the steel factory just outside town," Edward said finally, his voice low but clear. "Started when I was 17. My father worked there before me. My uncles too. It was the sort of place where a man thought he'd spend his life and retire with a gold watch and a handshake." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "But it didn't end like that." Keanu nodded gently, his eyes never leaving Edward's. They shut it down, Edward continued. Said costs were too high. Production could be done cheaper, overseas. Overnight, the place that had stood for nearly a century was gone. Thousands of men and women out of work. Some moved. Some didn't make it at all. He exhaled slowly, his gaze falling to the table. I stayed. Too old to start over, too stubborn to leave the town my wife and I built a life in. The mention of his wife softened his tone. His eyes grew distant, tracing memories no one else could see. Elaine, he said, her name spoken like a prayer. We were married nearly 50 years. She was the kind of woman who could make a stranger feel like family within 5 minutes. We used to come here every Friday, without fail. She'd order the chicken sandwich, and I'd get soup, just like today. We'd sit right over there by the window. His hand lifted slightly, gesturing toward a booth 2 tables down, where the sunlight spilled across the vinyl seats. For a moment, his lips curved faintly, softened by memory. She'd laugh at the smallest things, said this diner made the best pie in the county, said it wasn't the food, though it was the feeling of being here, together. She made every place feel like home. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of a life lived in partnership, of Friday nights spent in a booth, of laughter that once filled the air where they now Saturday. Edward's voice grew quieter. She got sick though. Cancer. We fought it for years. The treatments, the bills, they drained everything we had saved. I sold the house, moved into a small apartment near the bus stop, still worked odd jobs where I could, just to keep the lights on and help with her care. But no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. Cancer doesn't care how hard you work. Keanu's face remained still, but his eyes softened further, reflecting the weight of the story. He didn't interrupt, didn't break the rhythm of Edward's confession. Edward swallowed hard, his voice carrying the ache of years compressed into moments. Elaine passed 3 years ago. Since then, he stopped, his hands tightening around one another. His shoulders slumped slightly, the quiet weariness of loneliness settling into his frame. Since then, it's just been me. The bills kept coming, even after she was gone. Hospital charges, medication, things insurance wouldn't cover. I paid what I could, still do, but it leaves little left. He lifted his eyes, meeting Keanu's gaze with a quiet vulnerability that seemed heavier than the words themselves. Some days, the hardest part isn't the bills, it's the silence. You go from having someone to share every thought with to waking up in a room that doesn't echo back your voice. The loneliness can eat you alive if you let it. The diner's noise had faded again, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to hear. Edward's story was no longer his alone, it belonged to everyone listening. And at that booth, across from Keanu Reeves, it finally had the space to be heard. Edward's fingers brushed the edge of the table, as though grounding himself. He stared at the untouched sandwich, his voice soft, almost breaking. I come here sometimes still, not every week like before, but enough. I sit, order soup, and remember her. The waitress used to smile when Elaine laughed. The cook used to wave when we came in, but now it's just me, and most people don't even notice I'm here. His throat tightened, and for a moment he paused. Keanu didn't move, didn't interrupt. He simply sat still, his presence an anchor. The silence stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. It gave Edward space to gather the fragments of memory without fear of being hurried. I'm not asking for pity, Edward said finally, his tone firmer now. I've worked hard all my life, paid my way, paid my debts, and stood on my own 2 feet. But sometimes, his eyes flickered toward Keanu. Sometimes you want someone to remember you were here. That you mattered. That your life wasn't just work and bills, but love and laughter and Friday nights in a diner with the woman you adored. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. His gaze was steady, unwavering. You mattered, he said softly. You still do. And you're not invisible. Edward's breath caught in his chest. He blinked hard, his eyes glistening but refusing to let the tears fall. He gave the smallest nod, as though Keanu's words had offered something deeper than comfort. They had given him recognition, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The diner, hushed again, seemed to carry the weight of Edward's story in its very walls. Patrons who had remained silent earlier now sat humbled, their meals forgotten. Some stared down at their plates, others glanced at Edward with newfound respect. His life, spoken aloud in fragments of love and loss, had reminded them all of what dignity truly meant. Keanu sat back slowly, giving Edward space to breathe. He didn't offer platitudes or promises, only presence. And in that quiet presence, Edward's story found the one thing it needed most: someone willing to listen. The booth felt different now. Edward's words lingered in the air, heavy with memory, softened with loss, but steady with truth. He had spoken, and for once, people had listened. Keanu remained across from him, his hands resting loosely on the table, his gaze calm and thoughtful. The hum of the diner had returned in small threads, but it was subdued, as if the room itself was still reflecting on what had been said. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but strong enough to reach not only Edward, but those who were listening without admitting they were. "Sometimes, pride and dignity are different," he said. His words moved slowly, deliberate, each one landing with weight. "Pride is something we keep inside, something that helps us stand when life tries to bend us. But dignity—" He paused, his eyes sweeping the room before settling back on Edward. "Dignity is something we owe each other. It's how we remind one another that we matter." The words cut through the hush, reaching tables beyond the booth. Patrons glanced up, caught in the truth of what they heard. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the sting of guilt pressing against their silence earlier. They had seen Edward mocked, seen him humiliated, and they had done nothing. Now, hearing Keanu's words, their silence felt heavier, more difficult to bear. A young mother at a nearby table leaned closer to her daughter, who had been quietly watching with wide eyes. She whispered softly, but not so softly that it went unheard. "That's how you treat people," she said, "with respect." The little girl nodded solemnly, her gaze fixed on Edward and Keanu, absorbing the lesson with a child's openness. It was a moment that would stay with her longer than any meal or casual conversation. Edward lowered his eyes for a moment, his weathered hands folding together as if holding on to the words. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that released years of weight, even if only a fraction. When he looked up again, there was the faintest glimmer of something in his eyes, something close to peace. At the counter, Fran, the waitress, exchanged a glance with another worker. She had seen thousands of customers come and go in her decades at the diner. She had seen cruelty and kindness, silence and courage. But never had she seen a moment quite like this one. Her lips pressed together as if holding back the need to speak, but her eyes softened with a respect she hadn't shown in years. Jason, still stationed near the kitchen doorway, shifted uncomfortably. The shame that had burned in him since Keanu's intervention only deepened with each word spoken now. Dignity was something he had stripped from Edward without thought, without care, and now he felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. He avoided looking at either of them, but he couldn't escape the truth that had been spoken aloud for everyone to hear. The atmosphere had changed completely. No longer was it a room where one man was humiliated while others pretended not to see. It was now a room where truth had been spoken, where silence had been broken, where a lesson hung heavy in the air, refusing to be ignored. Keanu sat back slowly, giving Edward the space to eat, giving the room the space to breathe. His presence was steady, not demanding attention, but commanding it nonetheless. The message had been delivered, not in anger, not in shouting, but in calm truth that no one could deny. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the silence of guilt or fear. It was the silence of reflection, of people taking in the truth they had just heard and quietly measuring themselves against it. Edward lifted his spoon once more, sipping the broth carefully. His hands still trembled, but there was less hesitation in them now. He looked across at Keanu, And though his lips didn't form the words, his eyes said them clearly. "Thank you." Keanu returned the look with the smallest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that carried more weight than 100 speeches. He hadn't stood for recognition, hadn't spoken to impress. He had simply done what needed to be done, and in that simplicity, the entire diner had been given a mirror. At a table by the window, an older couple leaned close together, whispering. The man shook his head slowly, murmuring, "We should have said something." His wife placed her hand over his, her face lined with regret. Around them, others wore the same expression, the discomfort of realizing silence can wound just as deeply as cruelty. The young mother near the booth leaned down again to her daughter, her voice firm but tender. "You see that man?" she asked, nodding toward Edward. "He worked hard all his life. He loved his wife, and today he deserved to eat in peace. That's what respect means. Never forget it." The girl nodded, her small fingers tightening around her mother's hand. In her wide eyes was the reflection of something lasting, the kind of lesson children carry with them far into adulthood. Even Fran, who had been serving at the diner for decades, finally set her towel down and walked closer. She didn't interrupt, didn't insert herself into the conversation, but she lingered just near enough to hear Edward's quiet voice and Keanu's steady replies. She had seen men treated badly before. She had stayed silent more times than she cared to admit. But today, watching one man stand for another, she felt something stir in her that she hadn't felt in years. Hope that things could be different. Jason, still half hidden by the kitchen doorway, could not avoid hearing every word. His arms were folded tightly across his chest, his face red with a shame he couldn't shake. He shifted, restless, his earlier arrogance burned away. Though no one said his name, he knew the weight of the lesson had landed squarely on him. Keanu leaned back, his voice soft again, but carrying across the booths. Respect isn't charity, it isn't extra. It's the bare minimum we owe each other. And when we forget that, we lose more than kindness, we lose our humanity. The words lingered, sharp and clear, searing into the air like a brand. No one missed them, no one could ignore them. Edward lowered his gaze, a faint smile touching his lips. For the first time since Elaine's passing, he felt something he hadn't expected to find that day. Not just dignity restored, but belonging. And across the diner, men and women who had once looked away now looked inward, carrying with them a quiet vow that the next time they saw someone treated as less, they would remember this moment. The diner remained hushed, the weight of Keanu's words still pressing gently against every corner of the room. Edward sat across from him, eating slowly now, each spoonful no longer burdened by humiliation but lifted by dignity. Patrons shifted in their seats, glancing toward the booth every few moments, as though afraid to look too long but unwilling to turn away. It was then that the smallest figure in the diner broke the silence. A little girl slid down from her seat at a table near the window. She was no more than 7, her dark hair in soft braids, a stuffed rabbit clutched firmly in her hand. Her mother whispered her name, Sophie, wait, but the child was already walking with determined steps toward the corner booth. All eyes followed her as she moved. Her shoes tapped softly against the floor, her stuffed rabbit swinging by one ear. The innocence in her face carried no hesitation, no fear of propriety. She stopped at the edge of the booth where Edward and Keanu sat, looking up at them with wide, curious eyes. She tilted her head slightly, her voice light and unfiltered by the weight that had hung in the diner all morning. "Is he your grandpa?" she asked, pointing to Edward with the paw of her rabbit. The question floated through the silence, disarming in its simplicity. Patrons who had been locked in guilt and reflection felt a soft chuckle escape their lips, not mocking, but relieved. Even Edward blinked in surprise, his weathered face softening as he looked at the little girl standing so earnestly before him. Keanu leaned forward, his expression warm, his voice gentle. "Not my grandpa," he said softly, his gaze sliding to Edward before returning to Sophie. "But my friend." The words landed with unexpected power. The innocence of the child's question, paired with Keanu's tender reply, dissolved the last remnants of tension. In the diner, smiles broke across faces that had been solemn, eyes softened, and the heaviness of silence gave way to something lighter, something closer to hope. Edward's lips trembled, but not with humiliation. His eyes glistened, and for a moment he pressed a hand against his chest. No one had called him friend in a long time. The word was simple, yet it carried the weight of belonging, of being seen not as a burden, but as someone worth sitting beside. Sophie's eyes widened with delight. She clutched her rabbit tighter and held it up to Keanu. "Can you sign Mr. Whiskers?" she asked. "Then I can tell everyone my rabbit met your friend, too." The request drew quiet laughter from the surrounding booths. Her mother pressed her hands to her mouth, embarrassed but smiling, while her father shook his head with a helpless grin. Keanu accepted the stuffed rabbit with care, holding it as though it were something precious rather than worn and patched. He pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, uncapped it, and gently signed his name along the fabric of the rabbit's ear. When he handed it back, Sophie beamed, hugging the toy tightly against her chest. She looked up at Edward then, her voice bright. "I like your friend." Edward's chuckle was soft, almost hidden, but it was there. He nodded slowly, his voice quiet, but filled with something the room had not yet heard from him: joy. "So do I." The room breathed again, this time not in tension or guilt, but in the warmth of innocence that had reminded them all what respect and kindness truly looked like. Sophie clutched her rabbit, the signed ear pressed close to her cheek as if it had instantly become a treasure. Her eyes darted back and forth between Keanu and Edward, curiosity bright in her gaze. "If he's your friend," she asked, tilting her head toward Edward, "can I be his friend too?" The question drew another ripple of gentle laughter across the diner, but this time the sound was free of tension. It was warm, filled with the innocence only a child could summon. Edward blinked at her, startled, his lips parting as if unsure how to respond. Then he smiled faintly, the lines of grief and hardship softening for the first time in years. "I'd like that," Edward said, his voice low but steady. "I could use another friend." Sophie beamed, bouncing slightly on her toes. She extended Mr. Whiskers toward him, as if offering a handshake through the rabbit's paw. Edward reached out, his hand trembling, but instead of shaking the toy, he gently patted it. Sophie giggled, the sound bubbling like sunlight through the heavy air. Her mother finally stood and walked over, laying a hand gently on her daughter's shoulder. She looked at Edward, then at Keanu, her voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you for showing her what kindness really looks like." Keanu shook his head gently, his voice calm. "She already knew. Children always do. They just remind the rest of us when we forget." The words carried beyond their small circle. People sitting at other tables exchanged glances, some nodding, others bowing their heads, humbled by the reminder. The innocence of a child had done what adults often fail to: strip away pride, expose the simple truth, and leave only humanity in its place. Sophie's mother guided her back to their table, but the little girl kept glancing over her shoulder, waving her rabbit toward Edward as though cementing their new friendship. Edward lifted a hand in return, his faint smile lingering long after she sat back down. For a moment, the diner was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of quiet that follows a lesson learned, the kind that soaks into the walls and stays. Edward looked across the table at Keanu, his voice hushed. "She reminded me of Elaine," he said. "Elaine always believed people were good at heart, no matter what." Keanu's eyes softened. "She was right," he replied. "Sometimes it just takes a little girl with a rabbit to remind us." The tension that had once gripped the diner was gone. What remained was something far stronger: shared understanding, renewed dignity, and a child's innocent reminder that kindness is never complicated. The diner had just begun to find its rhythm again. Plates clinked gently, conversations returned in soft threads, and Edward sat with Keanu, his shoulders lighter than they had been when he entered. The moment of peace, however, was fragile. The bell over the door jingled sharply, and a group of young men in their 20s pushed inside. Their voices were loud, their laughter careless, the kind that filled a room without regard for anyone else in it. They jostled one another as they entered, their boots stomping against the floor, their energy brash and untempered. They looked around the diner, seeking amusement, and their eyes landed on Edward. His worn coat, his weathered face, his careful movements, they saw none of the dignity he carried. Only an opportunity for mockery. One of them nudged the other, whispering too loudly to be missed. "Looks like Grandpa wandered in from the alley." Another laughed, adding, "Surprised he could afford a seat. Bet he's been sitting here all day nursing a cup of water." Their laughter rang out across the room, harsh and cutting. Patrons who had just begun to relax stiffened again, guilt from earlier rushing back. No one wanted to see the humiliation repeat itself. Edward's spoon trembled slightly in his hand, though his eyes stayed on his bowl. He had grown used to barbs like these. Years of loneliness had hardened him to insults, but they still cut. Before Keanu could rise, another figure moved. Jason, standing near the counter, straightened. The same waiter who had once mocked Edward now stepped forward, his voice tight but clear. "That man paid for his meal," Jason said. His tone lacked arrogance, carrying instead a firm respect. "He belongs here just as much as anyone." The diner froze. Patrons turned in surprise toward Jason, the very one who had humiliated Edward earlier. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, but his words were steady. The young men laughed again, their bravado swelling. "Relax, waiter boy," one sneered. "We're just joking. Don't get all heroic on us." But Jason didn't flinch. His gaze shifted toward Edward, then back at the group. "It's not a joke," he said, louder this time. "Respect isn't a punchline." A hush rippled through the room. Patrons exchanged glances, the weight of Jason's transformation heavy in the air. He had crossed the line from cruelty to courage, and everyone knew it. The young men scoffed, rolling their eyes. One leaned on the counter, smirking. "What are you now, the respect police?" It was then Keanu finally stood. His movements were deliberate, calm, the same quiet authority he had carried all morning. He stepped away from the booth and faced the group. The laughter faltered, not silenced yet, but thinned. His eyes were steady as he spoke. "Character is measured," Keanu said softly, his voice carrying across the diner, "by how you treat those who can give you nothing." The words fell into the room like a stone into water, rippling outward until every corner was still. The room absorbed Keanu's words in heavy silence. Even the kitchen noises seemed to still, the hiss of the grill fading into the background as if the very building was listening. The young men shifted, their grins faltering. One of them scoffed nervously, trying to cover his discomfort. "It was just a joke, man." But the words landed weak, flimsy compared to the truth hanging in the air. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply stood with the calmness of someone who had lived enough life to know the weight of what he spoke. If your jokes strip someone of their dignity, then they're not jokes, they're weapons, and the measure of a man is whether he lifts people up or pushes them down. The eldest of the group shifted on his prize, feet, his bravado cracking. His eyes darted around the room, seeing not laughter but disapproval on every face staring back at him. The silence was no longer passive, it was judgment. Edward sat quietly at the booth, his spoon lowered, his gaze fixed on the man standing for him once again. There was no humiliation this time, no shame, only the quiet strength of knowing he was not alone. Jason stood straighter behind the counter, his earlier shame now replaced with something closer to pride. For once, he wasn't the source of cruelty, he was part of the defense. The transformation was not lost on the patrons. They had seen his arrogance, but now they saw his repentance. One of the young men muttered, "Let's just get a table," his voice low, uneasy. The others followed, their swagger dimmed, their eyes avoiding Keanu's steady gaze as they slipped into a booth near the back. Their laughter didn't return. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't heavy with guilt. It was filled with a lesson that had been spoken plainly, a truth no one could deny. Keanu returned to the booth and sat across from Edward once more. He didn't smile, didn't boast, only resumed his quiet place as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the diner knew differently. Fran, from behind the counter, wiped her hands on her apron and shook her head softly, her voice carrying across the room. "Been working here 30 years, she said, "and I've never seen anyone put it better." Murmurs of agreement followed. A man at the counter tapped his coffee cup and said to no one in particular, "That's the kind of thing you don't forget." The young mother leaned once more toward her daughter, who was still clutching her rabbit tightly. "Did you hear that, Sophie?" she asked. "That's what it means to have character." The girl nodded solemnly, repeating softly to herself, "How you treat people." Edward exhaled slowly, the faintest smile touching his lips. His eyes glistened again, but this time not from humiliation, only from gratitude. The lesson had been spoken, and it had been heard. The diner fell into a respectful quiet, each person knowing they had witnessed something more than a confrontation. They had witnessed a truth spoken aloud, one that would echo long after they left. The diner's quiet held steady even after the young men slouched into the booth at the back. Edward lifted his spoon again, but his thoughts had drifted elsewhere. He looked at them, really looked, and a flicker of recognition crossed his weathered face. Their features, though young and restless, carried familiar traces, lines in their brows, the shape of their jaws, even the way they held themselves. He set his spoon down and leaned slightly toward Keanu. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of certainty. "I know those boys' families," he said. "Their grandfathers worked the factory with me." Keanu tilted his head, watching him closely. Edward's eyes softened, not with resentment, but with memory. The one with the dark hair, his grandfather, was Charlie Mathers, strongest man I ever saw on the assembly line. Could lift more than 2 men put together. And the tall one with the sandy hair? His granddad was Frank Doyle, used to bring in donuts every Saturday for the crew. Said no man should work a shift without a little sweetness. Edward's lips curved faintly at the memory. "We built that place together. We built this town together." His words weren't loud, but the diner was listening. Even the young men at the back heard, their laughter replaced with uneasy stillness. Edward straightened slightly, his frail frame carrying new strength. He turned his head toward them, his voice steady, clear enough to cross the room. "Your grandfathers were good men," he said. "Men who worked hard, stood shoulder to shoulder, and never turned their backs on each other. I was proud to call them brothers." The young men froze, their bravado cracked open by the weight of shared history. The tallest of them, the one Edward had named Frank Doyle's grandson, shifted uncomfortably. His face flushed as he realized the man he had mocked knew his bloodline better than he did. "My grandpa, Frank Doyle?" he asked, his voice stumbling. Edward nodded. Frank was a man of honor, and Charlie too. They wouldn't have wanted this. "They taught us respect, taught us that every man had worth, no matter what he carried in his pockets." The young men exchanged uneasy glances. One leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "I didn't know you knew them." "I knew them well," Edward replied. "We bled together in that factory. We built steel that stood in skyscrapers across the country. And when hard times came, we shared what little we had. That was the kind of men they were." The silence was heavier now, but it wasn't shame alone. It was recognition. The young men shifted again, their earlier arrogance replaced with the discomfort of realizing they had insulted not just an old man, but a living connection to their own family's legacy. Finally, the one who had laughed loudest at Edward earlier cleared his throat. His voice was low, halting, but honest. "Sir, I'm sorry. We shouldn't have said what we did." His words cracked the tension. The others followed, nodding, murmuring apologies that carried the weight of sincerity. Their voices lacked swagger now. They were voices of grandsons humbled by truth. Edward studied the young men for a long moment, his weathered face calm, his eyes soft with something deeper than reproach. He could have scolded them. He could have lashed back with the anger he had every right to feel. But instead, his voice came steady, low, and filled with grace. "You're young," he said, "and young men sometimes forget what was built before them. But your grandfathers, Charlie, Frank, and the others, they gave their strength so you could have the chance to stand here today. Never forget that. Never throw away the dignity they carried." The words carried across the diner like a bridge between past and present. The young men bowed their heads, their arrogance gone. They weren't being lectured, they were being reminded of who they came from and who they could be. The tallest one, Frank Doyle's grandson, swallowed hard and stepped forward a little, his voice quiet. "Thank you for telling us," he said. "We didn't think. We were stupid." His eyes flicked toward Edward's bowl of soup. Can I buy your meal, sir?" Edward shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "No, I don't need that. But I'll take your respect. That's worth more than money." The response drew a murmur of agreement from around the room. Patrons who had sat in silence earlier now nodded, some smiling faintly, others blinking back the sting of humility in their own hearts. The young men nodded, sincerity written plainly on their faces. They weren't embarrassed boys anymore. They were grandsons, standing in the shadow of men who had earned respect with sweat and sacrifice. Keanu watched it all quietly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes shining with approval. He leaned slightly toward Edward, his voice low, but audible. "You turned them, not me." Edward shook his head. "No, their grandfathers turned them long ago. I just reminded them." The truth of it settled into the room like a steady light. Fran, the waitress, wiped her hands again and spoke softly from the counter. "That's the kind of talk we need more of around here." A few patrons clapped gently, not applause for spectacle, but in recognition of something honorable, something healing. The young men, now subdued, returned to their booth, but they didn't slump or laugh. They sat straighter, quieter, glancing often toward Edward with something closer to reverence. The bridge had been built between their youth and his years, between their arrogance and his wisdom, between the memory of their grandfathers and the dignity they now owed to others. Edward leaned back in the booth, his shoulders relaxing. For the first time in a long while, he felt not only seen, but connected. His history no longer just memory, but something that still mattered. Across the diner, patrons carried the weight of what they had witnessed. They had seen hostility turned into connection, disrespect turned into apology, silence turned into unity. The generational bridge had been built before their very eyes, and none of them would leave without carrying part of it home. The diner's atmosphere had changed. The rowdy laughter was gone, replaced with a calm hum of conversation and quiet reflection. Edward sat taller in the booth, his spoon moving steadily now, while Keanu's presence at his side kept the room grounded in silence and respect. At the counter, Mike Wheeler, the owner, watched it all. His arms were crossed against his chest, his face drawn in lines that had deepened over the years. He had owned the diner since his father passed it down to him, but he had let the grind of bills and the weight of profit twist his perspective. For too long, he had allowed the place to drift from what it had once been, and today, in front of everyone, he had been reminded of that. Mike finally stepped away from the counter, walking slowly toward the corner booth where Keanu and Edward Saturday. His footsteps were heavier than usual, but not with arrogance. They were the steps of a man humbled by what he had seen. He stopped just beside the table, his voice low but steady. "Keanu," he began, his throat rough, "I need to thank you, not for standing up today, though God knows that was needed, but for reminding me of something my father used to say." Keanu looked up at him, his gaze calm, inviting him to continue. Mike exhaled, his hand brushing nervously against the edge of the booth. "My father built this diner. Said it wasn't just a place for food, it was a place for community. Said a meal wasn't just a plate of eggs or a bowl of soup, it was belonging. That was the lesson he carried every day until the one he handed this place over to me." His voice faltered slightly, shame crossing his face. "And somewhere along the line, I lost that." Got caught up in margins, hours, complaints, making sure the bills stayed paid. I let things slip. I let people like Edward feel like they didn't matter here. That's on me." Edward paused, his spoon resting in the bowl, his eyes lifting slowly to meet Mike's. The hurt of earlier lingered, but there was also patience in his gaze. Mike's voice dropped, thick with sincerity. "Edward, I owe you an apology. I should have stepped in sooner. I should have made it clear this place will always welcome you, no matter what. From this day forward, you'll never doubt that again. You have a seat here for as long as this diner stands." The words carried, and though they were spoken to Edward, the entire diner heard them. Heads nodded slowly, approval building across the room. Keanu's gaze softened, his lips curving faintly. He leaned back slightly, his voice calm and steady. "Not lost," he said gently. "Just misplaced, and you found it again." Mike swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. He nodded once, firmly, the weight of the moment pressing into him like a vow. The diner, once shaken by cruelty, had rediscovered its purpose. Mike remained standing by the booth, almost hesitant to move. His eyes shifted between Keanu and Edward, as if weighing the words that had just been exchanged. It wasn't just an apology. It was a turning point. For years, he had treated the diner as a business first, community second. Now he realized that the balance had always been backward. Edward gave a faint smile, his weathered features softening. "Your father was right," he said gently. "Places like this, they mean more than food. For people like me, it's one of the few places left where you can sit and feel like you belong. I'm glad you see it again." Mike lowered his head briefly, his chest tightening with emotion. "I won't forget this," he promised. "Not after today." From nearby, tables, customers shifted, listening. A man in a work shirt lifted his coffee, murmuring to his wife, "Sounds like he means it." A pair of teenagers whispered, but their eyes stayed fixed on the scene, learning something they'd never read in a book: humility. Keanu broke the silence with his usual calm. "It's not about grand gestures," he said softly. "It's about remembering that respect doesn't cost anything. You give it freely, and it multiplies. A place like this can heal, or it can wound. You choose which one it will be." Mike nodded, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the words. He reached out and placed a hand briefly on Edward's shoulder. "You're always welcome here," he said again, this time like a vow. Then he stepped back, giving the booth space. Edward's eyes shimmered with quiet gratitude. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. His presence had been acknowledged, his dignity restored. The rest of the diner carried on, but with a different spirit. Coffee cups clinked, forks scraped plates, but there was an ease now. The earlier discomfort had been replaced by something warmer, more connected. Keanu leaned slightly toward Edward, his voice gentle. "You see, sometimes people just need reminding. Once they're reminded, they don't forget so easily." Edward gave a slow nod. "Feels like I've been seen for the first time in a long while." His words hung in the air, reaching everyone who heard them. At the counter, Fran the waitress exchanged a look with Louisa the cook. Both women nodded silently, understanding what had shifted. This wasn't just about Edward. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or treated as less. The diner itself had changed, and those inside carried that lesson now. Mike returned to his post behind the counter, but he moved differently than before. Lighter, more purposeful. He greeted new customers with warmth, poured coffee with a steadier hand, and those customers, sensing the change, responded in kind. Edward picked up his spoon again, but his meal was no longer just soup and bread. It was a symbol, a reminder that dignity had been restored. Keanu sat beside him in silence, not needing to say more. The message had been delivered. The lunch rush had faded. Sunlight spilled in through the windows, painting long golden rectangles across the checkered floor. The hum of the diner was softer now, subdued after all that had unfolded. Edward sat quietly, his hands resting on the table. but there was a new calm in his posture, as though a weight he had carried for years had finally been lifted. Keanu remained beside him, silent, sipping the last of his coffee. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone had become a shield. Around them, other patrons carried on, though many still cast glances toward the booth where a moment of dignity had been restored. Edward reached slowly into the pocket of his jacket. His movements were deliberate, careful, as though the object he retrieved carried not just weight, but meaning. His hand trembled faintly as he pulled out a small piece of polished wood. He set it gently on the table between them. It was a chess piece, a knight, carved with steady hands despite age and hardship. The grain of the wood caught the light, revealing delicate cuts and smooth polish. It wasn't just a token. It was something Edward had made, a fragment of himself given form. "I carved this," Edward said softly, his voice carrying a quiet pride. "After the surgery, the doctor told me I needed something to keep my hands busy, something to keep my mind sharp. So, I started carving. Took me weeks to get this one just right." Keanu looked down at the piece, his eyes tracing every line, every groove. He didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he let the silence honor it first. Then, with a slow movement, he picked it up, holding it between his fingers as though it were fragile crystal. "It's beautiful," Keanu said, his tone low and reverent. "You put yourself into this." Edward nodded. "I made a whole set, but this one, this night, I kept it aside. Never quite knew why, until today." His eyes lifted, steady but shining with emotion. "I want you to have it." Keanu froze for a moment, taken aback by the gesture. "Edward?" he said gently. "This is yours. You worked for it, shaped it with your own hands. Are you sure?" Edward's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. "More sure than I've been about anything in a long time. Today I felt seen again, for the first time in years. I don't want to forget that. And I don't want you to either. So, I give this to you. A reminder." Keanu's chest tightened as he turned the knight slowly in his hand. The weight of it wasn't in the wood, it was in the meaning. In the time Edward had spent carving, in the love he had poured into the craft, in the trust of offering it to someone else. "I'll treasure it," Keanu said finally, his voice steady but carrying emotion beneath the calm. He met Edward's eyes. "I promise you, it will never sit forgotten in a drawer. It'll remind me of this day, of what it means to really see someone." Edward's hands rested flat against the table now, his shoulders easing back as though finally unburdened. His voice softened to a near whisper. "For so long, I thought I had faded. After Elaine passed, it felt like I was a ghost walking through familiar streets. People passed me, nodded politely, but they didn't really see me. Not until today." He drew in a slow breath, his weathered face lined with memory. "But when you spoke, when you told that boy it wasn't special treatment, just respect, something in me woke up again. That's when I knew where this night belonged. Not with me gathering dust, with you as a reminder that even old men like me still have a place in this world." Keanu studied him for a long moment. His expression was quiet, but full of gravity. "Edward," he said softly, "you were never invisible, just overlooked. There's a difference. And sometimes all it takes is one reminder for the world to open its eyes again." The words sank deep, not only into Edward, but into every Blang soul within earshot. A nearby couple set down their forks, listening with reverence. The waitress Fran paused mid-step, her tray balanced carefully, her gaze caught by the gravity of the exchange. Edward let out a long sigh, not of weariness, but of peace. "You've given me more than you know," he murmured. "A man can survive without riches, but he can't live without dignity. Today, you gave that back to me." Keanu shook his head gently, still holding the knight in his hand. "No," he said, "you never lost it. You carried dignity in the way you spoke, in the way you endured. All I did was remind others to see it." Edward's eyes shimmered, his lips trembled, then steadied. "Elaine used to say I had a stubborn streak. Maybe that's why I've lasted this long. But hearing you say that," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but the emotion in his face completed it. Keanu placed the chess piece carefully on the table for a moment, then extended his hand across the booth. Edward looked at it, then clasped it with surprising firmness, his rough fingers gripping tightly. The gesture carried more than words. It was recognition, a bond formed not by status or fame, but by the simple act of respect between two men who had crossed paths in a small-town diner. Around them, the diner was utterly still. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something rare, something worth carrying with them long after the coffee cooled and the plates were cleared. Keanu slid the knight carefully into his jacket pocket, tapping it lightly as if sealing a vow. "It's safe with me," he said. "Always." Edward nodded slowly, his smile faint but genuine. For the first time in years, he felt complete. The diner had quieted, not with the heavy silence of shame, but with the stillness of renewal. Plates clinked softly. Coffee poured gently. But every sound felt, touched by what had just unfolded. In the corner booth, Edward sat taller, no longer hunched beneath invisible weight. Keanu's presence had changed something lasting, not just for him, but for the entire room. Keanu shifted slightly, his hand brushing against his jacket pocket where the carved knight rested. He rose slowly, deliberate as ever, and placed his napkin neatly on the table. All eyes turned toward him, though no one spoke. Respect did not need to be announced. It filled the room naturally. Edward looked up, his weathered features filled with quiet gratitude. "Safe travels," he said simply, his voice low but carrying. Keanu tipped his hat slightly in reply, the gesture small but powerful. He took a step away from the booth, then another, his boots pressing against the checkered tiles with the sound of finality. As he moved toward the door, patrons straightened in their seats. Forks paused in midair. Conversation stalled. Some nodded quietly. Others simply held his gaze. None dared to interrupt the moment with applause or chatter. At the door, Keanu paused, hand resting against the frame. He turned back just enough to take in the sight. Edward, surrounded now by the younger men who had once mocked him, listening intently to stories of the old factory. Jason, standing closer than before, no longer aloof but attentive, his earlier arrogance stripped away. And Mike, behind the counter, upright, eyes clear, as though he had just inherited the diner anew. Keanu gave one last nod, tipped his hat, and stepped outside into the fading afternoon light. The bell above the door chimed once, soft and final, leaving the room wrapped in its echo. Inside, Edward found himself the center of quiet attention. The young men leaned closer, their faces earnest, hungry for stories of the past. "Tell us what it was like," one asked. Edward chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Hard work, long hours, but pride. That factory wasn't just bricks and machines. It was our lifeline. It built this town." Jason hovered nearby, no longer the center of disdain, but a student, absorbing each word. He nodded when Edward mentioned long shifts, his expression one of someone beginning to understand a world he had never lived through but had inherited nonetheless. Mike, watching from the counter, felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His father's voice returned to him, words he had ignored for too long. A diner wasn't just about transactions. It was about people, about dignity, about giving every man, woman, and child who walked through the door a sense that they belonged. Today, thanks to Keanu's quiet stand, that lesson had been carved into the heart of the diner once again. Edward's stories flowed more easily now, his voice steady, his hands animated as he painted pictures of the past. He spoke of mornings when the factory whistle called the whole town awake, of the sweat and camaraderie on the line, of how even in the hardest winters, men still walked through snow to punch the clock. The young men listened, as though hearing about another world. Their earlier bravado melted into respect. Jason leaned closer, hesitant at first but compelled by what he heard. "Did it really feel like family?" he asked quietly. Edward nodded without hesitation. It was family, not by blood, but by choice and by struggle. When one man fell behind, another picked up the slack. When one was sick, others covered the shift. That's how we survived. That's what dignity looked like, not in words, but in the way we carried each other. The room was still, every table leaning into the lesson. Mike polished a coffee pot with slower, more deliberate strokes, his eyes fixed on Edward. In that moment, he wasn't just hearing an old man's stories, he was hearing his father's lesson echoed back to him. Finally, Edward's voice softened, his gaze lowering for a moment. It's been years since anyone asked me about that. Years since I felt like my voice mattered. Today, though, he looked around, meeting eyes at nearby tables, then Jason's, then Mike's. Today reminded me that even when the world forgets, dignity never disappears. It just waits for someone to see it again. The words carried weight. The diners shifted uncomfortably, guilt flickering across faces that had stayed silent earlier. But there was also relief, knowing they had witnessed something transformative, something they could now carry forward. At the counter, Mike finally spoke, his voice steady. My father used to say something whenever he saw a man put down in public. He'd say, "A man who stays silent while another is humiliated shares in the shame." His words rang through the diner like a bell, clear and unyielding. Heads nodded. The truth of it was undeniable. They had all been silent once, but today they had seen what silence allowed and what one voice, quiet but firm, could change. Outside, the sunlight dipped lower, painting the town in warm amber. Keanu walked steadily down the street, his figure unhurried, his hat low, his steps echoing with purpose. He didn't need recognition, applause, or thanks. The carved knight in his pocket was enough. He had left Edward with dignity restored, and he had left the diner with a memory no one inside would ever forget. Inside, the diner felt alive again, more human than it had in years. The food hadn't changed, nor the walls, nor the checkered floor. But the spirit had. It was once again a place of belonging. And as the bell above the door swayed gently, the lesson lingered in every heart. Dignity is not optional, it is owed. If you believe dignity should never be denied, share this incredible story. Would you have spoken up that day? Tell us in the comments.